Somewhere at the edge of known space, there is a station that nobody chooses. They end up there, the way people end up anywhere they didn't plan for. Station 9, outer quarter, cold metal, burnt fuel, a place that asks nothing of you because it expects nothing from you either. Pan down, the dock, 0347, empty, almost empty. A woman sits at the platform's edge, alone, still as something that has stopped believing in movement. Her wedding clothes, deep violet embroidered 11 days of travel, hang around her like a question nobody answered. The ship that brought her here? Gone. And then boots on metal. Slow. Deliberate. A man who has spent 3 years learning to want nothing walking towards someone who just lost everything. He stops. He says one word. Not a rescue, not a declaration. Just, hey. The dock smelled like burnt fuel and cold metal. It always did. Every night, every single shift without exception. Soren Calloway had stopped noticing it somewhere around month 4. Now it was just air. Just the thing his lungs processed while his hands moved crates and his brain stayed politely, carefully empty. The smell was part of the texture of not thinking. Background noise for a life that had become almost entirely background. That was the goal. Empty. Don't think about the discharge papers sitting in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet he'd found at the station's secondhand depot. Don't think about the apartment with one chair and no table and the particular quality of silence that lives in a space where only one person breathes. Don't think about how the guys from his unit stopped calling after the first few months, not out of cruelty, just out of the slow, inevitable drift that happens when two people no longer share a language. And Soren had stopped speaking theirs the moment he had handed back his equipment and walked out of the processing center on Callisto with a folder under his arm and nowhere specific to go. Don't think, just work. Station 9 floated at the outer edge of the Proxima shipping corridor, which meant it got the traffic nobody else wanted. Cargo vessels with registration codes that didn't match their manifest descriptions. Merchant ships running routes that didn't appear on official navigation logs. The kind of people and goods and transactions that needed a quiet place to transfer and disappear without too many questions asked by people paid to ask them. Soren fit right in. He wasn't hiding, not exactly, he was just parked. The way a vehicle gets parked when the driver isn't sure where they're going next and needs to stop moving before they can figure it out. 3 years of parking, the destination still unclear. 32 years old. Ex-Colonial Marine. Currently in possession of 2 pairs of work boots that had seen better deployments. One functional coffee maker rescued from a recycling bin and rebuilt from a 6-year-old forum post, and absolutely zero plans for anything resembling a future. Which was fine. Fine was survivable. Fine was manageable. Fine didn't ask anything of you. The night shift ran from 2100 to 0500, and by 0300 he'd already processed 14 pallets of refined ore from a freighter that had taken 11 hours to unload, because 3 of the loading arms had calibration issues that nobody had bothered to log. He'd also redirected a misrouted shipment of agricultural equipment that had somehow ended up in the wrong quadrant of the dock entirely and eaten approximately half a protein bar he'd discovered in the inside pocket of his jacket from an indeterminate number of days ago. Productive. 347, the last cargo freighter of the night, a mid-size hauler called the Meridian Cross that always came in slightly overloaded and slightly undercrewed, had finished its unloading. The dock crew drifted off in their usual clusters. Loud, tired, talking about nothing and everything the way people do when they've spent 8 hours doing physical labor and their bodies are exhausted but their mouths haven't gotten the message yet. Soren stayed behind, like he always did. He did a slow circuit of the platform, checked the mooring locks on bays 1 through 9, confirmed the loading arms were retracted and secured, made sure the weight sensors along the south edge had been properly reset after the Meridian Cross's overloaded pallet situation had briefly thrown 3 of them into error state. He didn't do any of this because it was his job. He did it because Going back to the apartment meant sitting down, and sitting down meant thinking. And he'd gotten very good at understanding the specific chain of causation that led from sitting down to thinking to the particular kind of 0400 despair that had no name and no cure except to keep moving. So he kept moving until he stopped. There was someone sitting at the far end of the dock, right at the very edge where the platform ended and the atmospheric shield began, that boundary where inside became almost outside, where you could see the stars through the transparency field, but still breathe recycled station air, legs dangling over the side, still as something that had decided to stop. Soren's first instinct was the practical one. Look for whoever was supposed to be with her, because nobody sat alone at the edge of the dock at 03:47 in the middle of the night shift changeover. That wasn't a thing that happened without context, without something having gone significantly wrong somewhere upstream. She was Valari. Even from 40 meters away, he could tell. The silver-blue tint of her skin caught the dock lights in a way that was specific, not dramatic, nothing like the bioluminescent species he'd encountered in the outer corridor postings during his service years. Just different. The same way certain metals look different from certain minerals, even when they were the same color on the surface. Like light was interacting with her at a slightly different angle than it interacted with everything else. She was wearing ceremonial robes. He'd seen Valari traders come through Station 9 before, not often, but enough. He'd looked up the clothing once out of genuine curiosity after a particularly elaborate arrival that he'd accidentally stared at longer than was probably polite. The layered fabric, the embroidered hem in the traditional pattern, the particular shade of deep violet that the bonding manuals, which he'd absolutely read as part of a very casual, very non-specific interest in Valari cultural customs, indicated as the color of first bonding ceremony dress. Wedding clothes. She was sitting alone at the edge of a cargo dock at 03:47 in her wedding clothes. And the ship that had been moored in Bay 4 was gone. He'd processed its departure himself 2 hours ago. The Callaway Marchant private vessel registered out of Proxima Station passenger and light cargo. He'd logged it out of the system at 0151 and watched it clear the atmospheric shield and disappear into the corridor without thinking anything particular about it. He was thinking something particular about it now. Soren stood still for a moment, let his brain do its thing, the thing it had been trained to do and had never fully stopped doing even when everything else about his former life had been stripped away. Gather information, assess variables. Don't move until you understand the situation well enough to move correctly. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. Her hands were folded in her lap with a precision that took effort, the particular deliberate stillness of someone working very hard to hold themselves together and who understood that if they moved even 1 inch in the wrong direction, something would give way that they might not be able to put back. He knew that stillness, had worn it himself for the better part of a year, had practiced it in the processing center bathroom mirror, actually in the days after the discharge, standing there rehearsing the specific arrangement of facial muscles and body posture that communicated "I am fine" while the inside was doing something that had no comfortable name. He walked toward her, not fast, not with urgency because urgency would startle, not slow because slow would feel like hesitation. Just walking. The way you'd walk towards something fragile that you wanted to reach before it fell but didn't want to rush. The dock plates rang softly under his boots, and he could tell by the slight change in her posture that she heard him coming. Her shoulders pulled in just fractionally, bracing. "Hey," he said. Not brilliant. Absolutely not the most eloquent opening line ever delivered at 0347 on a cargo dock by an ex-military man to a woman sitting alone in the wedding clothes. But it was what came out. Honest, at least. She looked up. And he... Right. Okay. He had not been prepared for that. Her eyes were the color of the deep space photographs that had hung in the recruitment office back on Callisto, The ones the admin staff had put up to make the place feel less like a processing facility and more like an invitation. That specific shade where black stops being absence and starts being something with texture, where dark has depth that you could actually fall into if you stood too close. The Valari called them star-caught eyes. He remembered reading that in some cultural reference document at some point in his life and thinking it was the kind of phrase that was too poetic to mean anything specific. He was revising that assessment. Her face was angular and fine-featured in the way Valari faces tended to be, a precision to the bone structure that looked deliberate, like something designed rather than grown. Beautiful, that was the accurate word, even though it felt insufficient. Beautiful and exhausted at exactly the same time, in the specific combination that happens when someone has been performing composure for so long that the performance itself has become visible. The effort showing through the surface. She'd stopped trying to hide it, run out of resources for the performance. "I'm fine," she said, accented standard. The Valari cadence underneath it, something musical in the structure of the sentence, the way certain syllables held slightly longer than human speech patterns, would the way the phrase moved in a way that made even flat words sound like they had texture. She paused, looked at Bay 4, at the specific absence where a ship had been. "I am waiting for transport." Soren looked at Bay 4, looked back at her. "Last scheduled transport left about 2 hours ago," he said. "Next one's at 1100. She said nothing, which was its own complete sentence. He should have offered to call the station coordinator, should have mentioned the passenger lounge on level 3, which was slightly dingy, but had seating that wasn't a cargo dock edge. Should have asked in a professionally concerned way whether he could contact anyone on her behalf. Instead, he said, "I've got coffee." She blinked. "In the maintenance bay?" He gestured back toward the dock structure. "I'll be honest with you, it's not good coffee. I salvaged the machine from a recycling bin about a year ago, but it's hot and it's available right now, which it seems like might be relevant." She looked at him for a moment, like she was running a calculation that required more variables than he could see. Whether this required more energy than she currently had. Whether the risk profile of following a stranger to a maintenance bay outweighed the alternative, which appeared to be continuing to sit at the edge of the dock at 0347 alone. Then she stood up, slowly, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose body had stiffened around the shape of grief while they sat in one position long enough for it to take hold. "Coffee," she said, trying the word, like she was checking whether it still meant what she thought it meant. "Yeah, all right." And she followed him. The maintenance bay was to be clear, not an impressive space. Metal walls, a folding table, 2 chairs that didn't match each other or anything else in the room. The salvaged coffee maker on the counter functional, but it made a sound during the brewing cycle that suggested it was working harder than it had been designed to. Fluorescent light overhead that ran slightly too yellow. A stack of manifests on the counter that had been there long enough that Soren had stopped seeing them and started treating them as furniture. He poured 2 cups, set one on the table in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it immediately, not drinking, just holding. Like warmth was the actual thing she needed, and coffee was simply a vessel for it. He sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke, which sounds like it should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't. There are 2 kinds of silence, the kind that demands to be filled, that sits in a room like something accusatory, like a question waiting to be answered, and the kind that is simply space. Room for things to settle. Room to breathe without performing the breathing. Soren had lived alone long enough to know the difference from the inside. This was the second kind. She wasn't performing grief at him. He wasn't performing concern back. They were just 2 people sitting in a room that smelled like machine oil and mediocre coffee, and neither of them needed to be anything specific right now. He drank his coffee. She held hers. The station made its background sounds, the low continuous hum of atmospheric processing, the distant percussion of something heavy being moved in a far bay, the soft, white noise rush of recycled air moving through vents, the sounds of a place that never fully slept. After a while long enough that the coffee had moved from very hot to comfortably warm, she said quietly, "My name is Lysel of the Third Moon." "Soren Calloway," he said, "from Callisto originally, now mostly just here." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not yet, maybe not for a while, but the muscles around her eyes changed in a way that meant she'd heard the word originally and understood its particular weight. "You said originally, Retuo," she noted. "Yeah, well." He looked at his cup. "Home is one of those concepts that gets more complicated the longer you think about it." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." The way she said it, those two words, the specific gravity in them, not casual agreement, but something that came from the same place the word originally had come from in his own sentence. Someone who had just watched a fixed point disappear and was still calculating what navigation looked like without it. He didn't push. He had learned over years of working with people in difficult situations in the Marines and processing centers in 3 years of dock work, where you saw all kinds of arrivals and departures that you couldn't rush someone toward their own pain. The only thing rushing did was make them shut the door. You had to just be there when they were ready to open it. He waited. She got there after the second cup. "I was promised," she said to a merchant from Proxima Station. Her voice had shifted, flatter, more deliberate, the voice people use when they've decided to be clinical about something that isn't clinical at all. "His name is Dorian Vale. We had been contracted for 2 cycles. My family and his representatives worked out the terms over several months. Among my people, arranged bonding is not unusual. It carries honor for the family, for both parties." She paused. "I understood this. I accepted it. I prepared for it." Soren nodded, didn't speak. "I traveled 11 days to reach him." She was looking at her hands on the cup now, the table surface, the space slightly to the left of his face, anywhere that wasn't directly at him. "When I arrived at the dock, he was there to meet the transport, with his staff, his cargo coordinator, 3 members of the crew." Another pause longer. "He looked at me." She stopped. He waited. "He looked at me," she said again, and there was something very precise in the repetition she was making herself say it completely, not abbreviating it, not skipping past it. And then he turned to his cargo coordinator and said, her voice didn't waver, but something moved behind her eyes fast and deep, like something diving away from a light. He said, "The goods are not as specified. Wrong model. Return it." The maintenance bay went very quiet. Soren put his cup down. He put it down slowly, carefully, deliberately, because the way his hands wanted to put it down involved considerably more force and would probably result in a dented table, and that wouldn't be useful to either of them. In front of the crew, he said, it wasn't a question. In front of everyone on the dock, she smoothed the embroidered fabric of her robe across her knee, a small, careful gesture. "I am 28 years old. In Valari culture, this is considered it is past the primary bonding age for many families. I was aware of this going in. My family had assured me that Dorian Vale had specifically agreed to my age, that he had confirmed the arrangement with full knowledge of." She stopped, took a breath, restarted. "It does not matter what he agreed to. What he said at the dock in front of his crew and mine was wrong model. Return it." The room held that. "That's what he said." "Yes." Soren was quiet for a moment. "Then he's an idiot." She looked up. "A very specific kind of idiot," Soren continued. "The kind that exists in every species I've ever encountered, which I used to find depressing, but now I think might just be the universe's way of being consistent. Equal opportunity distribution of spectacular stupidity across all known sentient life." She stared at him. "You're 28, he said. "Yes." "I'm 32. A pause. "And you are telling me this because I've spent 32 years on this side of the conversation, and not once has anyone looked at me and said I was too old for something. He leaned back in his chair, which means the bar is either completely different depending on who's being measured, which, yes, obviously demonstrably, or the bar was specifically calibrated so that you couldn't clear it no matter what you did. Either way, that's his problem, not yours. Lysell looked at him for a long time. The measuring look, trying to determine genuine or performative. Sincere or the polished version of sincere that people deploy when they want to seem like they mean it without the inconvenience of actually meaning it. Whatever she found, she apparently decided it was worth continuing. My family, she said quietly, spent everything they had to arrange this. The negotiation fees, the transit contracts, the bonding gifts that are required by our code to be presented on arrival. She looked at the embroidered hem of her robe again. They have nothing left, and I am returning to them with, she stopped, with shame, which in my culture is not a small thing. You didn't do anything wrong. In my culture, she said, outcomes do not always care about reasons. That hit him in a specific place. He understood that from a specific angle, a very personal, very well-documented angle that lived in a folder in the bottom of a filing cabinet with his name on it, in a summary that described his most correct decision as inconsistent with operational objectives. Yeah, he said, I know something about that. She looked at him again, that quiet, precise attention. You were military, she said. He wasn't surprised she'd noticed. The posture, probably. The specific way he'd approached her on the dock, calculated, calm, deliberate pace, non-threatening body language. Old habits from contexts where getting that wrong had consequences. Colonial Marines, he said. 3 years active, then not. What happened? A pause. He considered the question not whether to answer, but how much of it to answer and in what form. Short version or long version? Whichever one you're willing to give right now. Fair. Short version, I was given a choice between following an order I couldn't follow and leaving. I left. He looked at his cup. They'd say it the other way around that they left me, but the result was the same. She sat with that. And you came here, she said, looking around the maintenance bay, at the mismatched chairs and the salvaged machine and the stack of manifests that had been there long enough to become part of the architecture. And I came here, he agreed. It's not what I planned, but it's what I have. Do you regret it? The question arrived without warning. The Valari directness, he'd noticed it in the traders who came through Station 9, the way they asked what they needed to know. Without the social scaffolding, humans tended to build around difficult questions. He thought about it honestly, because she'd asked honestly, and that required the same in return. The choice, no. He met her eyes. What it costs, yeah. But the choice and the cost aren't the same thing, and I've spent 3 years trying to keep them separate. The choice was mine. The cost was something they did to me. Those are different. She turned that over carefully. That is a distinction worth holding on to, she said softly. Yeah, he nodded. It is. The station clock on the wall read 0419. Outside through the maintenance bay's small window, the dock platform was completely empty, vast and quiet under the artificial lights, the atmospheric shield shimmering faintly at the edges where the stars pushed against it. Lysell looked at the clock. I should find the passenger lounge, she said, if the next transport is at 1100. Lysell. She stopped. He hadn't planned this part. That was the honest truth, and he was aware of it. He was not by nature or by training or by 3 years of deliberate practice a man who made spontaneous decisions. Military protocol had trained the impulse out of him, and the years since had reinforced the lesson. Think first. Assess. Move deliberately. Accept. Except she was sitting in his maintenance bay in wedding clothes she'd traveled 11 days to wear, and someone had looked at her and said wrong model in front of a crew, and in about 6 hours she was going to get on the 1100 transport and go home to a family that had spent everything they had and she was going to arrive with nothing except the specific weight of a humiliation she'd done nothing to earn. And Soren Calloway, who had not done anything impulsive in years, who kept his head down and moved crates and drank salvaged coffee and told himself that empty was fine, that manageable was enough, opened his mouth. "Marry me," he said. The quality of the silence that followed was completely different from everything before it. This silence had mass, had physical presence. It occupied the room. Liesel didn't move, didn't blink. Looked at him with those impossible eyes like she was waiting for the rest of the sentence, for the punchline, the qualifier, the additional words that would arrive to explain what the previous words had meant. They didn't come. He stopped, restarted. "I know how that sounds." "Do you?" "It sounds insane." "Yes, but hear me out, please." She didn't stand up, didn't say no, sat exactly where she was, which he took as permission to continue and continued accordingly. "You need a marriage that's real and legally recognized so you can go home into something other than a return package," he said. "Even, clear, no performance in it. I know that's a blunt way to frame it, and I know the situation is more complicated than that, but that's the practical reality of where you are right now. Yes." A pause. "The financial circumstances," she said carefully, "and the social, both of those things, yes." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to pretend I understand every layer of how it works in Volari culture. I probably have about half of it right on a good day. But I know enough to know that going home the way you're currently planning to go home doesn't help you, doesn't help your family, doesn't fix anything." Liesel looked at him, very still. The measuring look again, but deeper this time. "And you," she said, "what do you get from this?" He thought about the one-chair apartment, the empty shifts, the way he sometimes reached the end of a week and tried to name one thing that had mattered about it and came up blank. Not unhappy exactly, just absent, like he'd misplaced himself somewhere around month 4 and stopped looking. "Honestly," he said, "please, I don't know exactly." He looked at the table, at the rings his coffee cup had left on the surface. "I know I've been here 3 years, and I stopped wanting things somewhere along the way without noticing. And I looked at you out there on that dock, and I thought, here's someone who deserved better. Here's someone that someone else looked at and saw a wrong model. And he paused, tried to find the actual words. I don't want you getting on that transport home feeling like you weren't worth choosing, because you are worth choosing, whether or not you believe that right now." The fluorescent light hummed. Atmospheric processors ran their quiet cycle. Lysell looked at this man, this stranger with the salvaged coffee maker and the filing cabinet full of discharge papers, and the careful, deliberate way he put his coffee cup down when he was angry, and the complete absence of performance in anything he'd said for the last hour and a half. She looked for a long time. Then she said, "You know what we are. My people." Valerian, he said, "Third Moon, mineral trading networks, traditional culture, strong family structures. Longer than average lifespan, I know the basics from the trading documentation." "Longer than average," she said, and something moved across her expression. Something complicated. "Soren Calloway, my people live on average 300 years. He went quiet, not reactively quiet, intentionally quiet, because this required actual thought and he wasn't going to give it fake thought. "I'm 28, that's it," she said. "By human standards, very young. And I will be what I am for a very long time. While you, won't be," he finished. "Yes." He sat with it, really sat with it, without flinching away or rushing to reassurance. Turned it over and looked at all the sides of it. She watched him think, and something about the fact that he was actually doing it, not performing consideration, not filling the silence with comfortable deflections, something about the genuine quality of his pause did something specific to the steadiness she'd been maintaining. "Okay," he said finally. She waited. "That's real," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't. I don't have an easy answer for it, and I'm not going to manufacture one. He met her eyes. But here's what I actually know. I don't want more time. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent 3 of those years being carefully, deliberately empty. What I want is to use the time I've got for something that matters. A pause. I'm not saying I know what this becomes. I'm not promising you forever in the way that sounds when someone says it at 400 after knowing each other for 2 hours. I'm saying I don't want you on that transport home feeling like you were defective, like you were returned, because that's wrong, and I think you know it's wrong, and I think you need someone to say it out loud. She looked at him. He looked back. I'm saying we could start, he said. That's all I'm saying. We could start and see what we are. And there it was. Not a declaration, not a speech, not the kind of moment that gets written into songs or embroidered onto ceremonial fabric. Just we could start, honest as the coffee, unglamorous as the fluorescent light, real in the specific way that things are real when they're not trying to be anything else. And Lysel of the third moon, who had spent 28 years being shaped into a particular kind of woman, for a particular kind of future, who had learned very early to fold herself smaller to fit the space that was made available, who had traveled 11 days in wedding clothes to stand in front of a man who looked at her and said, wrong model, and not even the decency to say it to her face, felt something shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, not the way things shift in stories. Just a small movement. The way something locked gives slightly when the right pressure is applied in the right place. Not open, just less closed. If I agreed, she said carefully, this would be a real marriage, registered under station law. Yes. And under Valari bonding code as well, which is considerably more complex than station law. There are documentation requirements, cultural compliance conditions, witness protocols that we wouldn't be able to meet fully, which creates its own set of complications. We can work through that together. She looked at him. Valari marriages are for life, she said, not as a caution, as information that required confirmation of receipt. That is not a cultural expression. It is law. It is the organizing principle of how we structure family property responsibility. I know, he said. Do you? I read the bonding code documentation when I was on the comm unit during the walkover, and he said, not all of it, there's a lot of it, but I understand the structure. She blinked. He had in fact done exactly that, pulled up the publicly available summary of Valari bonding code during the 3-minute walk between the dock edge and the maintenance bay because he'd known this conversation was a possibility the moment he decided to sit down, and he'd wanted to know what he was potentially agreeing to before he said anything about it. I'm not proposing a temporary arrangement, he said. I'm not saying let's do this for 6 months until the situation changes. I'm saying, he stopped. Something uncertain moved through his expression. Genuine uncertainty not performed. I'm saying I'd rather take a real chance on something that might matter than keep doing this. He gestured, not at the maintenance bay specifically, at the whole careful, deliberate, empty shape his life had settled into. The dock outside, the one chair, the 3 years of not wanting anything. Lysel followed his gesture, took in the bay, the dock beyond the window, the stars past that. Then she looked back at him. You are a strange man, Soren Calloway, she said. Yeah, he said. I've heard that before. A pause. I have one condition, she said. He waited. Honesty, she said. About everything. I have been negotiated with, managed, handled, contracted. For 2 years, every conversation I had about my own future was in some way a transaction, and I did not know it, and I am very tired of that. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was deliberate. If something is wrong between us, you say it. If something is hard, you say it. If you change your mind about any of this, I'll say it. If you regret, I'll say it. He met her eyes. Honesty goes both directions. She studied him. And if I find, she said quietly, that I am grateful, but that gratitude is all I have, that I cannot give you what a marriage should have, then you tell me, he said, and we figure out what comes next together like people do when they've decided to be honest with each other. That's the deal. That's the whole deal. Lysel was very quiet for a long time. The clock on the wall read 0451. Outside, the sky beyond Station Nine's observation windows was changing in the specific way it changed in the hour before the long corridor traffic began. The nearby star catching the edge of the atmospheric shield at an angle that turned everything a particular shade of gold that existed only at this specific time of the station's day. She said, "All right." Just that word, all right. Soren breathed. All right, he said back. The station's legal interface was on level 2 in a corridor between a parts supplier and a small canteen that wouldn't open for another 4 hours. The terminal was clean and bureaucratic and utterly indifferent to anything happening in front of it. It had processed thousands of legal registrations without once caring about the weight of any of them, which was fine. Neither of them needed it to care. They stood side by side and worked through the documentation. Soren had continued reading the bonding code during the walk not out of distrust, but because he wanted to understand what he was agreeing to for himself, not through explanation. By the time they reached the terminal, he had 60% of the structure and 40% of the implications, which wasn't enough to be expert, but was enough to be genuinely informed. The 60% he understood was, this is permanent, this is real, this is not a formality. This is the thing that your entire life will be organized around from this point forward. He'd agreed to that, he still agreed. They spoke their vows in standard because that was the common language between them, simple, clear, without flourish. And then Lysel spoke additional phrases in Valari. Low rhythmic. He didn't understand a word of it. She'd said they were the bonding words her people used, that they were important to say, and that was enough. He listened to every syllable. He watched her face while she said them. She wasn't performing. The careful, contained public face she'd been maintaining since the dock had shifted slightly, not dropped, not collapsed, but changed. Something in her eyes that had been braced was now incrementally something else. Something that looked like permission. Permission to be here, to occupy this decision fully. The interface logged the ceremony, generated the documentation, thanked them in the flat automated voice of a system that had done this many thousands of times and would do it many thousands more. Soren looked at the confirmation on the screen. Lysel of the Third Moon, Soren Calloway, bonded, Station 9, recognized under standard interplanetary law in Valari bonding code, real. He looked at her. She was looking at the screen. Her expression was something he didn't have a word for yet. Not happy in the simple sense, not sad. Something quieter and more complicated than either the expression of a person standing at the edge of something unknown and choosing deliberately to step off and find out. "Are you hungry?" he said. She turned. "What? It's almost 0600. That canteen opens in about 40 minutes. He paused. "They have eggs. I don't know if Valari eat eggs." Something shifted in her face, something small and involuntary. "We eat eggs," she said. "Good." She looked at him for a moment. "Soren." "Yeah. Thank you." Very quiet. Not for the marriage specifically, for the coffee and for sitting down on the dock. "You sat down first," he said. "You came to me first," she said back. He thought about that, about seeing her at the dock edge at 0347 and not thinking about it, just walking. The complete absence of deliberation in that approach. Just movement. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Through the canteen window, they could see someone at dish shed beginning the morning prep. Lights coming on, machine starting. They walked toward it. And neither of them noticed because, why would they? The morning was just beginning and there was coffee coming and eggs and a conversation. They were only at the very beginning of the figure, standing at the far end of the level 2 corridor. Standing very still, watching. Dorian Vale, 49 years old, merchant of Proxima Station, a man who had looked at a woman that morning and called her a wrong model and walked away without a second thought because that was simply how transactions were handled when they were no longer useful. He had not in fact left. He'd watched the ship depart from the observation window and then stayed, thinking, processing something that had occurred to him approximately 40 minutes ago and that he had been turning over ever since. He was not angry. Anger was not a useful business tool. He was recalculating. Because Dorian Vale had not built one of the most profitable independent trading operations in the Proxima Corridor by reacting emotionally to variables. He reacted to them strategically. He observed them. He determined their implications and adjusted his approach. He had looked at Lysell of the Third Moon this morning and made a decision, a clean, efficient decision based on a change in his own operational requirements that had rendered the bonding arrangement unnecessary. But something had happened since then, something he hadn't planned for. A dock worker, approximately 30, ex-military by the look of him, who had sat down with Lysell on the dock and walked with her somewhere, and was now apparently walking with her toward a canteen, as her husband, which meant something Dorian needed to think about very carefully. He turned away from the corridor, took out his comm unit, made a call. And inside the canteen, Soren Calloway and Lysell of the Third Moon settled into a booth that was slightly too small for the conversation they were about to have, and ordered eggs that neither of them was particularly hungry for, and really talked the way people do when they've just done something significant together and need to understand who exactly they've done it with. Not romantic, not the candlelit orchestral kind of moment. Something better, honest. They talked about where they'd come from and what they'd been afraid of, and the specific shapes their respective failures had taken, and what tentatively cautiously they might possibly hope. They talked until the canteen filled with the morning shift, and the light through the window shifted from gold to the flat white of operational day, and neither of them ran out of things to say. Later, walking back to his apartment, their apartment now a fact he kept encountering in his thoughts. Like an unexpected step, Soren would try to identify the moment the decision had actually been made. Not the moment he'd said it out loud. The actual moment. He'd concluded it was the silence. The first silence in the maintenance bay when neither of them had needed to fill it. You could fake a lot of things. You could perform sincerity convincingly enough to fool most people most of the time. But you couldn't fake that particular quality of silence, comfortable mutual, without expectation. That required something genuine on both sides. He could live with this. He had looked at her on that dock in those wedding clothes with that specific, carefully maintained stillness and made a choice. Not the first choice. The first choice had been to walk over. The marriage had been the second choice, but both of them came from the same place. He could not have lived with walking back to the maintenance bay and leaving her there. He knew himself well enough to know that. Liesel had asked to walk the outer observation deck before they went to sleep for a few hours. He'd said yes without hesitation. They walked the long loop of the deck in the morning light, the stars still visible through the transparency panels at this angle, and she asked him questions he hadn't expected. "Do you miss it?" she said. "The military." "Parts of it," he said honestly. "The structure, the sense that what I was doing had a clear purpose, even on the days I was too exhausted to feel anything about it." A pause. The feeling that I was somewhere for a reason. What happened to that feeling? Got filed under no longer applicable, he said, along with the rest of it. And now, he thought about it. The question deserved real engagement. "Ask me again in a year," he said. She turned and looked at him. And for the first time, not fractionally, she almost smiled. The shape of it, the possibility of it. "I will," she said. Soren looked at his wife. "Thought I have no idea what I just did." Followed immediately and with some surprise by good, because the things you know completely, the things you can see all the way around, The things that are contained and predictable and safe, those are the things that don't require anything of you. The things you can walk away from without looking back. This he couldn't walk away from, which meant it mattered, which meant he was, for the first time in a very long time, actually awake. He looked out at the stars. The corridor stretched away to the visible limits of the atmospheric shield, and beyond that, in the direction that wasn't quite visible, the third moon hung in its orbit around the primary, a place he'd never been, that he'd now be in some legal and permanent sense connected to. Strange, good strange. Station 9 hummed around them, shifting into its dayside cycle. Below, the morning crews were starting their shifts. The dock machinery was warming up. The great indifferent system of the station's commerce and survival was turning as it always turned, regardless of what had happened on Deck 2 in the hours before dawn. Lysel stood beside him. Her silver blue skin caught the morning light differently than it had caught the dock lights, warmer, less stark. Still extraordinary. And somewhere below them, in the Proxima corridor beyond the atmospheric shield, Dorian Vale's community connected to the person he needed to speak to, and he began carefully, methodically to adjust his plans. The dock smelled like burnt fuel and cold metal. It always did. But this morning, Soren Calloway noticed it, really noticed it, the way you notice things when you've suddenly remembered that you're alive. He looked at Lysel. She was looking at the stars. "Ready," he said. She considered. "Not entirely," she admitted. "Neither am I." They walked back inside, together, into a day that was going to be strange and complicated and completely without precedent, and into a life that had just quietly and irrevocably changed shape. Nobody tells you what happens after the decision, after the ceremony, after the moment that feels like the most significant thing you've ever done, standing in a corridor between a parts supplier and a canteen that serves eggs at 0600. Nobody tells you that the next morning you wake up and the coffee maker makes exactly the same sound it always made. The dock outside smells the same. The apartment still has one chair, except now there's someone else in it. And the someone else is standing in your kitchen in Valari, sleeping robes, layered pale with the kind of structural draping that suggested significant textile engineering, holding a protein packet at arm's length with the expression of a scientist who has just discovered a previously unknown category of error. "What," said Lysel, "is a textured nutritive compound?" "Breakfast," said Soren. She looked at him. "That is not breakfast. It's what I have in the kitchen currently." "Soren, I don't usually eat much before shift." "That is becoming clear." She set the packet down with the careful precision of someone returning a piece of evidence to its designated position in an ongoing investigation. "I am going to find the station market. It doesn't open until—" She was already putting on her jacket. 800, he finished, to a room that contained one fewer person than it had 3 seconds ago. He sat down on his one chair, looked at the spot where she'd been standing, looked at the protein packet. He got up and threw it away. He did not examine the symbolic implications of this too closely. The first month, it looked like many things. It looked like two people discovering the specific architecture of each other's habits. Soren took his coffee, blacked 2 cups silence before speaking a morning process that was less preference and more physiological requirement. Lysel read for an hour every morning before she was fully present in the world, cross-legged on the end of the bed with a data pad existing in a private territory that didn't require visitors and that he'd learned very quickly not to enter with conversation. It looked like the discovery that she took jokes seriously. Not as in she didn't find things funny. She found things very funny, but she approached humor the way a jeweler approaches a stone, turning it to find the angle, examining the facets. And when she delivered something, she did it with a deadpan so precise that Soren regularly took 2 or 3 full seconds to catch up, and he'd look over to find her watching him with the quietly satisfied expression of someone who had timed something perfectly. He loved this immediately and concealed it for approximately 3 weeks because she was already too pleased with herself about it. and there was no reason to make it worse. It looked like the evening she started explaining Valari bonding traditions, and he listened so carefully, asked follow-up questions, so specific, pursued the details with such evident, genuine interest that she stopped mid-sentence and said in a voice slightly different from her usual voice that no one had ever asked her these things before. Not like that. Not wanting to actually understand rather than simply be informed. He'd said people miss a lot when they're not paying attention. She'd given him the measuring look, the quiet, precise one, then looked away. But he'd caught the edge of something in her expression before she redirected something soft and startled. Like a window in a room someone had forgotten had windows letting in light. It looked like two people every single day choosing to stay. Without announcement, without ceremony. In the way that real choices happen not once dramatically but continuously in small increments in the accumulated weight of ordinary mornings. Nobody writes songs about this part because it doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like groceries and figuring out the station maintenance request process and a small disagreement about whether the recycling bin belonged to the left or the right of the kitchen counter. But inside that ordinary texture, quietly, without anyone declaring it, something was building. The way real things build, slowly, without drama, with the kind of structural integrity that comes from being assembled over time rather than assembled all at once. The first problem arrived on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were unremarkable days. They existed purely in the space between Monday's tentative optimism and Wednesday's resigned pragmatism without the personality of either. Nothing significant should happen on a Tuesday. And yet, Soren came off the night shift at 0500 and found the dock supervisor, a man named Renwick, waiting for him. Not at the shift desk where Renwick normally processed end-of-shift paperwork, actually waiting, standing near the exit bay with the body language of someone who had been given a task they didn't want and was going to complete it because completing it was better than not completing it, but was not going to enjoy the process. Calloway, Renwick, need to talk to you about your contract. Soren looked at him steadily. It's not up for renewal for another 2 months. Yeah. Renwick looked at the floor, at the wall, at the specific point in the air somewhere above Soren's left shoulder that people look at when they can't make eye contact but need to maintain the impression of engagement. About that, the thing about people who are bad at delivering bad news is that their badness at it doesn't make the news easier. It just makes it take longer. It took Renwick 4 full minutes to communicate 12 seconds of information the contract wasn't being renewed. Effective in 3 weeks, station management had restructured its labor allocation framework. Nothing personal, nothing personal. Soren listened to the entire 4 minutes. Who manages the dock operations contract, he said when Renwick finished. The parent company. That'd be the station administration. The parent company Renwick, the entity that holds the service contract for dock operations. A pause. Proxima Mercantile Group, Renwick said at the floor. The names sat in the air between them. Proxima Mercantile Group. Dorian Vale's network. Not his company directly. Dorian didn't own things directly from what Soren had been able to piece together in the brief research he'd done in the days after the bonding. He owned access, contracts, service relationships, the kind of invisible infrastructure that didn't show up on ownership registers but was everywhere if you knew what you were looking at. The dock Soren had worked for 3 years. The contract he'd held under Proxima Mercantile Group's service arrangement the entire time. Nothing personal. He nodded at Renwick, thanked him, walked out, stood on the dock in the early morning light and breathed cold air that smelled like fuel and metal, and thought with remarkable clarity, of course. Of course, he didn't tell Lysel immediately. Not because he was keeping it from her, the honesty condition was not negotiable, and he'd meant every word of it when he'd agreed to it, but because he needed to understand what he was telling her before he told her. He needed the full shape of the thing. He spent 3 days following the threads. Station 9's operational licenses and their parent entities. Labor contract structures in the Proxima Quarter network, the holding companies behind the service agreements. It was painstaking work done in the hours between shifts, sitting at the kitchen table. They had a table now because Lysell had found one at the station's second-hand depot and declared the structural situation unacceptable, with coffee going cold beside him and documents open on 3 different screens. He found it. All of it. Dorian Vawel didn't need to own Station 9. Ownership was expensive and accountable in ways that leverage wasn't. Proxima Mercantile Group held service contracts on 43% of the stations and installations in this section of the quarter. They didn't run anything directly. They simply ensured that running without them was difficult enough to be impractical. One call. From Dorian to the right contact at the right level of the Proxima Mercantile Group management structure, and Soren Calloway's contract renewal had been quietly, cleanly, professionally eliminated. No confrontation, no accusation, no drama that could be pointed at later, just a door closing softly. He told Lysell on the 3rd day, all of it. She sat across from him at the second-hand depot table and listened without interrupting. It was something she did, listen completely without the running commentary or the anticipatory responses that most people inserted into the middle of sentences. She waited until the whole thing existed before she responded to any of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He did this because of me, she said. He did this because he's trying to apply pressure to a situation, Soren said. That's different from it being because of you. The distinction is not as clean as you're making it. Lysell, she stopped. This is not yours, he said clearly, without room for equivocation. Don't pick it up. It doesn't belong to you. She looked at him. Something moved across her expression, complicated and layered the thing that happened when someone was trying to process something they'd been taught to process one way and were being asked to process differently. She'd been raised in a culture where responsibility moved in straight lines, where outcomes traced back to causes and the person at the origin point of the causal chain owned their part of it. She was trying to own a part of the chain that wasn't hers. What will you do? She said finally. Find other work, he said. Simple. There are other operations, smaller ones, independent contractors. I'll find something. She studied him. You're not afraid, she said, like she was noting a data point. I'm a little afraid, he said, but I've started from worse positions than this. Define worse. Discharge papers and a filing cabinet, he said. No apartment, no coffee maker, no table. He looked at the table. We're ahead of that on all counts. She looked at him for a long moment, then quietly. We will figure it out. He'd been using the word for 6 weeks and still caught himself slightly surprised by it every time. But she'd said it like it was simply the architecture of the situation, like the alternative hadn't occurred to her as a real option. Which, yeah, he was finding he agreed. 2 weeks later, the first letter came. It arrived through the station's external mail, routing the slow route, the one that meant it had traveled a significant distance through several relay points. The header was in Valari script. Soren couldn't read Valari script, but he could read Lysell's face, and her face when she saw the header went very still in a way that was not the good kind. I can step outside, he said. She shook her head. Stay. So he stayed. He sat on the couch. They had a couch now, which had arrived as a flat pack of components, and had taken 4 hours and one significant disagreement about the assembly instructions, and had resulted in a couch that was structurally sound and very slightly lopsided, and that he had become unreasonably fond of, and he watched Lysell read. She read it twice. He counted because he was paying attention. First pass, top to bottom, stopping at nothing. Then she went back and read it again more slowly, which meant whatever was in it was complex enough to require a second pass. When she finished the second time, she set the data pad down on the table, sat with her hands in her lap. Soren waited. My father wrote this, she said. Okay. His name is Aldrich. A pause. She looked at the window, at the stars. He has always been careful with words, precise. When I was at the bonding academy on Second Moon, when I was 12, 13, he wrote me long letters, always careful, like he was afraid of the words themselves and had to handle them very gently. He's afraid of these too. Yes, a pause. But he sent them anyway. Soren waited. He is apologizing, she said. The voice of someone holding something at arm's length to look at it. Clinical, controlled. He knew, she continued, not everything, but he knew that Dorian Vale's interest in the bonding was not entirely personal. That what Dorian wanted, at least in part, was access to my family's land claim on the third moon, the mineral reserves. He knew this was part of what Dorian was seeking through the arrangement. She stopped, restarted. He did not tell me this because he believed it was possible to have both outcomes. Dorian gets what he wants. My family gains financial stability. She paused. He thought he was being sophisticated. He thought he had found a way to get everything for everyone. A very long pause. He was wrong. He has known he was wrong since before I arrived at Station 9, he says. He knew it, and he sent me anyway. The apartment was very quiet. The coffee maker on the counter had cooled. The table lamp made a warm circle. Outside the station ran its usual operations, indifferent to everything. He sold me, Lisa said. The words arrived quietly. Not with anger. Anger would have had a shape to it and energy. This was something else. The quality of a person receiving a truth they had been half knowing for a long time. Not a surprise. A confirmation. The arrival of the thing you had been waiting to know without admitting you were waiting. He sold me, she said again, because he was afraid. And now he is asking me to forgive him because he is still afraid. Just afraid of different things now. Soren looked at her. Are you going to, he said. She picked up the data pad, put it down, picked it up again, held it without looking at it. I don't know what I want to do with this yet, she said. That's okay. She stopped, her hands in her lap folding and releasing, folding and releasing. I am very something right now, and I haven't found the accurate word for it yet. You don't have to find it tonight. I know, she looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but everything behind them was not. There was the specific quality of someone holding back something substantial through sheer precision of will, and the holding was taking most of her available resources. Soren, I need you to just... I'm right here, he said, not going anywhere. She breathed once, slowly. Tell me something ordinary, she said, in a voice she was constructing very carefully, word by word. Something about today, anything. So he told her about the misrouted atmospheric filter shipment in Bay 12, about the labeling error that had cascaded through 3 different processing systems in 2 different languages, about the argument between 2 dock workers, about whose jurisdiction the error fell under, an argument that had lasted 45 minutes and involved hand gestures that he demonstrated in detail, because the detail was the point. The detail was the thing that made it specific and real and present tense, and not about letters from the third moon. And Lysel sat beside him and breathed, and slowly, increment by increment, the tide receded. Not gone, not resolved, held. For now, that was sometimes the only thing available, and sometimes it was enough. Soren applied for other positions, 3 in the first week. All rejected the specific, polite rejection of a door being closed by someone who'd been told to close it and not to explain why. We've filled the position, thank you for your interest. He expanded the search. Adjacent stations, smaller independent operations, freelance cargo coordination, which didn't require a long-term contract, in which he had the specific experience for. Nothing. He got rejected from a maintenance coordinator role 4 hours away, a role he was objectively, demonstrably more qualified for than whatever they'd hired instead. The rejection arrived 12 minutes after he submitted the application. 12 minutes. Not enough time to read a resume properly, let alone evaluate it. Barely enough time to pull up the record and act on whatever flag was already attached to his name. He pulled every rejection, checked every timestamp. The fastest was 8 minutes. The slowest was 19. Not one was over 20. His name had been flagged in the Proxima Corridor's labor network. Not dramatically, not with any accusation attached. Just a flag. A quiet administrative deniable flag that meant this person do not hire. For reasons we are not going to document. Soren sat at the kitchen table after Lysel had gone to the station library. She'd found work there cataloging an incoming archive of Valari historical texts that required not just language knowledge, but cultural framework, the ability to understand what the documents meant beyond what they said and he thought. He thought about 3 years at Station 9 building something small and functional out of a situation that had been by any objective measure pretty bad. A discharge, a filing cabinet, a salvaged coffee maker. He'd made it stable, not good stable, and someone was now disassembling it piece by piece, not confrontationally, not visibly, just the quiet, methodical removal of options one closed door at a time. He was angry. Low and solid, like something burning deep underground where you can feel the heat through the soles of your feet but can't see the flame. But under the anger, the thing he hadn't expected was something sharp and clarifying. He wasn't going to fold. He'd folded before. When systems got big enough and strong enough, and he'd been told in a ways official enough that the fight wasn't winnable. He'd learned to distinguish between battles worth having and ones that would only cost you without changing anything. But this was different. Because in the station library right now, cataloging Valari historical texts with the quiet efficiency of someone who decided to make herself useful in a situation that hadn't been of her making, was a person who'd arrived at Station 9 in wedding clothes alone at 03:47 with nothing and had decided without drama to build something new. He wasn't going to fold. He opened his comm unit and started pulling documents. Station 9 is operational history. Proxima Mercantile Group service contract portfolio. The corporate records for the holding entities. The regulatory filings. The resource access dispute records which were public and which he had to request through 3 different archival systems before they materialize. He followed the thread for 4 nights, found it on the 4th. It was buried in a procurement record from 7 years ago. A shipping manifest tied to a resource access dispute on the third moon before the current bonding regulations, before the updated mining agreements that had codified Valari family consent requirements. The record connected Dorian Vale's trading company to a legal petition to access third moon mineral deposits. The petition had been denied. The denial was grounded in the updated Valari bonding code, specifically the provision requiring that resource access to Third Moon family lands required either a Valari blood claim or recognized bonding partnership with a family holding the land claim. Permanent, legitimate, logged with the High Council, a family like Lysel's family, Aldrich's family. Soren read this very carefully, then read it again. Then sat with it. Dorian Vale had arranged the bonding with Lysel not as an alternative to the resource access, not as a compromise or a secondary objective, as the mechanism. The only mechanism still available after the legal petition had failed. He hadn't wanted a wife. He'd wanted a legal instrument, a key, a recognized bonding that under Valari law would give him the access the courts had denied him. And Lysel had traveled 11 days in wedding clothes to be that instrument, until something had changed in Dorian's calculus, until the bonding had become, for some reason, Soren was still working through no longer the most efficient path. Maybe a new arrangement elsewhere. Maybe the extraction economics had shifted. Maybe the access was available through another route that had opened in the 2 years since the bonding contract had been signed. Whatever the reason, Dorian had decided the arrangement was no longer useful, had decided that at some point before Lysel arrived. And when she stepped off the transport and onto the dock, he'd exited. The goods are not as specified, not even a pretense of the person, not even the decency of a fabricated explanation. Just exit, except now. Now Soren had the documentation, the procurement history, the access dispute records, the bonding code provisions. And now Soren had a Valari wife legally bonded and recognized under both standard law and Valari bonding code, whose family held claim to the Third Moon reserves that Dorian Vale had been trying to access for nearly a decade, which meant Soren Calloway was structurally and legally directly in the way of whatever Dorian's current plan was. Not accidentally, architecturally, which explained the job blacklist. Which explained why Dorian wanted Soren gone rather than confronted, because confrontation created records, created visibility, created exactly the kind of scrutiny that would expose the procurement history and the access dispute and the real purpose of the bonding arrangement. Pressure was cleaner, pressure was deniable. Pressure until the financial strain became untenable, and Soren had to leave the quarter for work, at which point the bonding record became complicated and legally murky and potentially challengeable. And Lisa, if Soren left and she didn't follow, she was alone again. A different variable than a woman in a recognized bonding. If she followed and they moved, the bonding record moved with them into ambiguous territory. Either way, Dorian's access to the Third Moon reserves opened up again. Soren sat very still with all of this for a long time. Then he pulled out a fresh document. Not a complaint, not a petition, not anything official yet. A record. Careful. Time-stamped. Complete. Everything he'd found, he told Lysell that night. All of it in order from the procurement record to the access dispute to the mechanism and what it meant. She listened completely. Didn't interrupt. When he finished, the apartment was quiet for a long time. The reserves, she said. Yes. He wanted my family's land. Processing, deliberate. And I was how he intended to get there. Yes. Quiet. My father, she said slowly. He thought he was being clever. He knew about the resource interest and thought he was leveraging it. Dorian gets what he wants. The family gets financial security. He thought both things could be true at once. She breathed. He didn't think it was a sale because he told himself there was something in it for me too. But it was. But it was. She stood, walked to the window, stood with her back to him, looking at the stars beyond the atmospheric shield. And when Dorian found another way to get what he wanted or decided the cost of this way wasn't worth it anymore, I was just excess inventory to be returned. Yes. She stood at the window for a long time. What do you want to do with what you found? She said. That's not my decision alone, he said. She turned. It's your family's land, he said. Your father's choices. Your history with Dorian. I'm not making any moves without knowing what you want. She looked at him. You could use this against him, she said. I added to the trade authority, expose the access dispute, stop the blacklist. Probably yes. But the other question, he said, is what happens to your father when the documentation becomes public? She was quiet. He's the one who agreed to the arrangement, Soren said. His name is in the records. When this goes to the trade authority, he's part of the record. She walked back to the couch, sat beside him, close. The way she'd started sitting without announcing it, choosing proximity consistently without making it a statement. I need to think, she said. I know. I don't want to think alone. You're not. She looked at him. That look, the one he'd been learning to read over 2 months, the one that said, I'm trusting you with something specific. Receive it carefully. Tell me, she said, about the order you refused, the full version. He looked at her. In the Marines, she said, on the night we met, you said you refused an order and left. You've never told me all of it. He thought about whether he could say it out loud in a way that made it sound like what it was rather than what the discharge papers called it. We were deployed to a retrieval operation, he said. Civilian infrastructure, a small station on the corridor edge. There was an ongoing dispute about resource access, about who controlled what. He paused. We were sent to secure the area, standard language. But, but when we got there, the situation was active. There were civilians in the middle of it, not armed, not combatants. People who lived there and hadn't gotten out yet. And the order that came through, he stopped, started again. Securing the area in the specific language of the order meant not waiting for them to leave first. Lysel was completely still. My unit said no, he said, all of us. Command called us inconsistent with operational objectives and pulled us out. Discharge processing started the next day. Silence. The people who lived there, she said. Another unit went in after we were pulled. He looked at his hands. The records from that operation are sealed. I've never been able to access them. Lysel breathed. You lost everything, she said, because you had a line you wouldn't cross. Yes. And you've been here 3 years, she said, believing that I was done, quietly. That the world had looked at my most correct decision and filed it under failure, and the accounting was settled, and now we were just going to coexist without asking anything of each other. She looked at him. You weren't done, she said. No, he said. I wasn't. Her hand finding his arm. Valari warm, that quality of warmth that was slightly different from human warmth. Steadier, deeper, like a different thermal register. Neither was I, she said. They sat like that. Outside Station 9 ran its operations. The corridor continued its commerce. And somewhere in the network of invisible infrastructure that Dorian Vale had spent years building, the pressure continued to be applied. But Dorian didn't know about the procurement record. Didn't know about the time-stamped document building in the station's local server archive. Didn't know about the letter from Aldrich folded carefully in the drawer of a second-hand depot table. Didn't know that the 2 people he was trying to displace had just in an apartment that smelled like coffee and had a slightly lopsided couch move fractionally closer to each other. The problem with invisible plans is they're built on the assumption that the variables will behave like variables. Like they'll respond to pressure the way inanimate systems respond to pressure, by moving along the path of least resistance toward whatever equilibrium the plan requires. They work perfectly until they encounter something with its own reasons. The second letter came 10 days later. This one Soren saw first. His name on the header, official, the Valari sigil of the Third Moon bonding registry in the corner. He read it at the kitchen counter before Lysel was awake. Read it once, set it down, picked it up, read it again. There was a process in Valari law called the validity inquiry, a formal proceeding by which the legitimacy of a bonding could be challenged under specific conditions. Rush ceremony questioned cultural compliance, disputed intent. Someone had filed for one. The inquiry would be held before a panel of the Valari High Council. It would determine whether the bonding of Lysel of the Third Moon and Soren Calloway was legitimate under Valari Bonding Code. If it was found to be invalid, the bonding would be dissolved. Lysel would return to unbonded status, and Soren would return to whatever he'd been before, which was increasingly something he was finding it hard to fully remember. He stood at the counter with the letter. From the bedroom, the soft sounds of Lysel beginning to wake. The small shift of someone moving from sleep toward the world. He thought about not telling her right away, getting ahead of it, bringing her a solution instead of a problem. He thought about that for approximately 5 seconds. Then he put the letter on the table where she'd see it and went to make coffee, because she'd asked for honesty about everything. And that wasn't a conditional he could suspend when honesty was inconvenient. That was the whole deal, the part that made it real. He heard her footsteps, the kitchen light, the specific pause of someone encountering something unexpected before they have had coffee, which was not ideal but was unavoidable. He turned from the counter with both cups and found her already reading it. Standing still, robes not quite tied the particular focused frown of someone processing information that is unwelcome. She read to the end. put it down, looked at him. Dorian, she said, almost certainly. She took her coffee, sat down. They looked at each other across the second-hand depot table. Soren thought about the document in the archive server, about the procurement records and the access dispute history and everything he'd spent 4 nights finding. He thought about the woman on the dock, about what empty felt like now compared to what it had felt like before. We're not folding, he said. Lysol wrapped both hands around her cup, looked at him over the rim. No, she said, just that, no. And the quality of it, the specific, clean, decided quality of that one syllable, landed in his chest with the weight of something real. The most important conversations don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they're just two people at a kitchen table before the station wakes up with coffee, going slightly cold, deciding, not yet, not us. Try again. The notification with the formal date arrived on a Friday, 17 days. Soren read it, set his comm unit on the table, picked it up, read it again. 17 days to travel to Second Moon and stand before 7 members of the Valari High Council and demonstrate that the bonding registered at Station 9's legal interface at 0600 on a Wednesday morning between a Valari woman in ceremonial robes and an ex-colonial Marine in work clothes with no witnesses and a fluorescent light in a salvage coffee maker in the next room was legitimate, real, worthy of recognition under 300 years of Valari bonding code. The bonding code that he had now read approximately 70% of, understood approximately 40% of, which referenced cultural traditions that predated human space travel by roughly 2 centuries, and which apparently had 7 council members with strong opinions about all of them. He put his comm unit in his pocket and went to find his wife. She was in aisle 7 of the station library archive. She spent 4 mornings a week there now. What had started as temporary work cataloging an incoming collection had become something more permanent because the station archivist had discovered what Soren had been watching with quiet satisfaction for weeks, that Lysel didn't just know the Valari language. She knew the cultural framework, the historical context, the way certain texts needed to be handled because they weren't documents in the archival sense, but living records in the Valari tradition, which meant they had requirements beyond preservation. She was good at it. She was good at most things she decided to do in the particular way of someone who approached tasks completely rather than partially, who brought the same precision to cataloging an archive that she brought to making a case or folding a garment or constructing a deadpan joke. He noticed things. He noticed she'd started leaving coffee on the counter before she left in the mornings. Never mentioned it, just observed that he was slower to wake, that his first conscious act was always to start the machine, and that having it already done reduced his morning disorientation by a measurable amount. So she started doing it quietly, as a fact of their shared life rather than a gesture requiring acknowledgement. He noticed she'd started saying his name differently. Not formally the way you say someone's name, when it's stopped being a proper noun and started being a habit, when it's become its own kind of location. He noticed somewhere around week 5 or 6 that the apartment was wrong when she wasn't in it. Not empty, he'd known empty. This was different, like a sentence with a word missing, grammatically incomplete, like the space was waiting for something to return and make it make sense. He'd noticed this and been careful not to examine it too closely, because examining it closely would require naming it, and naming it would make it real in a specific, irreversible way that he wanted to arrive at properly in its own time rather than rushing it. He found her cross-legged on the floor of aisle 7 because the lower shelves required it, and she'd decided this was acceptable. Data pads surrounding her, handwritten notes in a combination of Valari and Standard. The organized chaos of someone deep enough in a project that the surface of the project had become navigable only to them. She looked up when she heard him, read his face. How long, she said. 17 days. She absorbed that. Sit down, she said. He looked at the floor. There's probably a stool I can... Soren, sit down. He sat on the floor of aisle 7, because apparently this was his life now, And it was fine, and actually the floor of a library was not the worst place he'd sat in recent years by a significant margin. Tell me everything, she said. They worked through it together. The validity inquiry would be held at the Valari Council Hall on Second Moon. That meant travel 19 hours transit time each way. Soren would need to arrange time away from the cargo coordination work he'd picked up at a small, independent operation 2 stations over, the only work in the corridor that wasn't blacklisted. The operation was run by a woman named Perel, who had a long-standing and apparently deeply satisfying personal dispute with Proxima Mercantile Group, and who had expressed what could best be described as enthusiastic, vindictive satisfaction in hiring someone they'd flagged. They would face 7 council members. Questions about the bonding's formation, about their knowledge of each other, about cultural compliance, about intent versus procedural convenience. They're going to ask us why, Soren said. Why the way we did it? Why that fast? Yes. And the answer is the truth, she said, which is complicated. Is it? He looked at her. From where I'm sitting, it's pretty simple. She considered that. Tell me, she said, what your simple version is. My simple version, he said, is that I sat down on a dock and offered you coffee that wasn't good, and we talked for 9 hours, and at the end of 9 hours, I didn't want you to leave the way you were planning to leave. He paused. And the longer I think about it, the more it seems like simple is actually the right register for this particular truth. It doesn't need to be complicated to be real. She looked at him. Something in her face did the thing he'd been watching for months. The surface, precise, careful, and taint shifted slightly. Something warmer underneath, less defended. I chose you, she said, not loudly, not dramatically. I need you to know that clearly before we go into that chamber. Not because I had no alternatives. I had alternatives. I could have gone home and managed what came next, and it would have been hard, and I would have survived it. She held his gaze. I chose you because in 9 hours you spoke to me like my opinion was the most important information in the room. Every single time. I am not a person who ignores that quality of data. He looked at her for a long moment. That, he said, is the most clarifying thing anyone has ever said to me. I am aware it lacks conventional romance. No, he said, it doesn't. The corner of her mouth, just fractionally. There's something else, she said. Okay. I wrote back to my father after the inquiry notice came. I told him what was happening. She looked at the data pad in her hands. I didn't ask him anything. I didn't tell him what to do. I just told him. Soren was quiet. I don't know if I want him to respond, she said. Also fine. She looked at him. You are very calm about things, she said. I am not at all calm about this, he said. But active panic seems like it would get in the way of the significant amount of preparation we have to do in 17 days. She made a sound, small, involuntary. Let's go home, he said. I'll make dinner. We can plan, and you can assess whether my Valari pronunciation has improved or whether I'm still managing to say things that mean something entirely different from what I intend. Last week, you told the archive coordinator you hoped her grandmother had a comfortable coffin. I thought I was asking about the filing system. You were not. The learning material I found is genuinely misleading, or you are genuinely a liability in Valari social contexts. Both things can be true. He stood up, offered her his hand. She took it. They walked out of aisle 7 and through the library and into the corridor, and neither of them let go. They left for Second Moon on a Tuesday. Of course it was. The transit ship was a mid-range commercial vessel, the kind that carried cargo and passengers in a proportion that slightly prioritized the cargo's comfort over the passengers. The berths were narrow. The recycled air had the particular quality of long-haul corridor travel, breathable, technically adequate, with a faint suggestion of many previous journeys compressed into the filtration system. Lysel read. Soren looked out the window at the stars and thought about what he was going to say to 7 council members who had spent careers adjudicating bonds that had been planned across generations, conducted with witnesses, executed with full cultural ceremony. He thought I met her on a dock. I offered her coffee that was mediocre at best. We got married in a quarter at 0600. She is the most interesting person I have encountered in 32 years of living, and the only one whose silence feels like company rather than absence. And the apartment is structurally wrong when she isn't in it. And I cannot tell you the exact moment that became true. I can tell you it is true now. Whether 7 council members with 11 volumes of bonding code find that sufficient, he'd find out. The transit took 19 hours. They slept in shifts because the berths were designed for single occupancy, and they'd booked 2 adjacent ones to be practical. Lysell took the first 4 hours, Soren the next 4, and then they were both awake in the 0300 quiet of deep corridor space, sitting in the narrow observation alcove at the end of the passenger section with the stars dense and particular outside the window. "Are you afraid?" Lysell said. "A little," he said. "You?" "Yes," without hesitation, "but not of the council." He looked at her. "My father wrote back," she said. "4 days ago. He said he's coming to Second Moon." Soren went still. "He said he wanted to do something that mattered," she continued, "even if it was too late to matter in the way he should have mattered earlier." "Did you tell him not to come?" "No." "Did you tell him to come?" "I sent him the date and the time," she said, "and then I stopped writing." He sat with that. "How long has it been since you've seen him?" he said. 8 months. He came to say goodbye before I left for Station 9. She was quiet for a moment. He held my hands when he said it, both of them. He looked at me for a long time like he was trying to keep the image of something. She paused. I thought he was being sentimental. I didn't know what I know now. The stars moved past the window, or the ship moved past the stars, depending on the reference point. "He was memorizing you," Soren said, "because he knew he was sending you somewhere he wasn't sure you'd come back from the same." "Yes." A pause. "That makes it worse, yes. And also slightly better, that it mattered enough to him to try to hold on to it." Soren looked at the stars. "He did a wrong thing," he said carefully. "He's a person who did a wrong thing. Those aren't the same as a wrong person." She was quiet for a long time. "I'm not sure where the line is," she said. "You don't have to find it tonight." "No," she leaned her head back against the wall of the alcove. "No, I don't." They sat in the 0300 quiet, let the stars do what stars do, burn quietly without opinion about any of it. Second Moon was old in the way that places are old when they've been continuously inhabited for centuries. Not old like ruins, old like sediment. The weight of duration in the stone. The way the buildings were integrated into the rock rather than placed on top of it, like they'd grown there rather than been constructed. The particular pale gold of the light filtered through an atmosphere that had been tended for generations. Everything here had been somewhere for a very long time. Soren felt very new, which seemed appropriate. The council hall was at the settlement center. Stone exterior, high interior, 7 seats arranged in a curve at the room's far end, elevated just slightly enough to communicate gravity without performing it. The Volari tendency toward understatement in architecture. The message was present without being heavy. This is a place where things are taken seriously. They arrived early, because Soren was the kind of person who arrived early to things he wasn't sure about, especially those. They sat in the waiting area without talking much, which was them, which was fine. They'd become fluent in the language of being present without needing to fill the presence with words. He looked at her. She was wearing deep blue, not the wedding robe, something she'd chosen specifically for today. Still Volari in its structure and the way the fabric moved. Her silver blue skin against the deep blue fabric. Her eyes, the particular stillness of someone who has made their decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Not the stillness of the dock, not holding something together through force of will. The the stillness of something already decided. Hey, he said. She turned. Whatever happens in there, he said. I meant all of it. Every word. She held his gaze. I know, she said. A pause. So did I, she said. All of it. He breathed. All right, he said. Let's go in. And then the hall door opened behind them, and Aldrich walked through it. Soren had been building an image of him from Laysel's descriptions over 2 months precise with words afraid of them. A man carrying a wrong decision and not knowing where to put it down. The reality was taller, silver-haired, the angular bone structure he recognized from Laysel's face, the same quality of attention in the eyes. But something about the way he held himself was compressed inward, like someone who had been making themselves smaller for months and had lost track of their actual dimensions. He saw Laysel, stopped, 20 feet between them, neither moved. The specific way people look at someone they've been afraid to see for a long time, like the looking itself requires something. Soren stepped to the side, not leaving, just making room. Aldrich crossed to his daughter, stood in front of her, looked at her face the way he'd apparently looked at her 8 months ago when he came to say goodbye, like he was committing something to a record that he needed to keep. Except this time he knew exactly what he was looking at and what it had cost. Lysa, he said. One word. Her name, with the weight that names carry when they mean something. Father, she said. Silence. Soren examined the floor with considerable interest. Aldrich said quietly, I am not here to ask forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because you deserve someone to stand up for you when it was needed, and I was not that person. I cannot undo that. A pause, but I can be here now if you'll allow it. Lysa was very still. Why did you come, she said. The true answer. Aldrich looked at her. Because you are my daughter, he said, and because a man who had known you for 9 hours, a stranger on a dock at night, decided you were worth standing up for. His voice held the steadiness of someone maintaining it through effort. And I thought if a stranger can see that clearly, then I have no excuse for not seeing it myself. Something moved in Soren's chest. He looked at the floor harder. Lisa looked at her father for a long time. Then she said, you can stay. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not the resolution of 8 months of grief and betrayal and complicated love. Just you can stay. Which was Soren thought everything that it needed to be in this moment. The beginning of a possibility, not the completion of one. The council chamber had its full gravity. 7 members, high-backed chairs, the pale gold light of second moon through tall windows, the botanical smell that Soren had noted on the way in, something the Valari cultivated specifically for formal spaces, meant to encourage precision of thought. It was honestly doing slightly contradictory things to his thinking right now, making things very clear and very loud simultaneously. The primary council member center seat, clearly the senior of the 7, with the specific expression of someone who had heard every version of every story and was waiting with unhurried patience for you to arrive. At the true one looked at him with silver eyes that he had not been prepared for. Counselor Sylvain, silver eyes, decades of exactly this kind of work visible in the way she held herself. This inquiry was filed by a party claiming insufficient intent in the bonding. She began in standard of courtesy. We're here to determine whether the bonding of Lysel of the Third Moon and Soren Calloway meets the requirements of legitimacy under Valari Bonding Code. She looked directly at him. Mr. Calloway, when did you first meet Lysel of the Third Moon? The morning of our bonding, he said, about 9 hours before we registered. Not a flicker. In 9 hours you concluded she was someone you wished to bond with. Yes. Why? Soren took a breath. He thought about the dock, the coffee, the maintenance bay with its mismatched chairs and its salvaged coffee maker, the silence that hadn't been uncomfortable. He thought about a woman who said, I'm fine when she wasn't, who said I merely await transport when she had nowhere specific to go, who took the offer of coffee because she was too tired to perform composure anymore. Because she was sitting alone on a dock in her wedding clothes, he said, and someone had looked at her and called her a defective product, and that was, he paused. That was wrong, not complicated, wrong, immediately, clearly, simply wrong. So you married her to correct an injustice? No. He shook his head. I married her because I talked to her for 9 hours and recognized something I hadn't felt in a long time. That I was with someone worth being present with. He paused. Those are different things. Sylvain held that. You are aware that Villari bonds are permanent under our code. Yes. You are aware your wife's lifespan will significantly exceed yours. Yes. And you proceeded anyway. Yes. Why? The same question, different register. Because the length of something, he said slowly, is not what determines whether it's real. I'd been alive for 32 years, the last 3 of them. I'd been alive in the technical sense, only present without being there. She was the first thing in those 3 years that required me to actually show up. He paused. I didn't want to protect myself from that by running timeline calculations. Sylvain looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Lysel. Why, she said. Lysel said, because he sat down. Sylvain waited. He didn't have to, Lysel said. There were other options available to him. He chose to walk to where I was and sit down, on a cargo dock at 0347, and not ask me to be anything specific. A pause. I have been negotiated with arranged, contracted, managed. For 2 years, every conversation I had about my own future was a transaction I didn't know I was in. And in 9 hours, this man spoke to me consistently as if my perspective was the most important information in any given exchange. She was steady, clear. I am not a person who makes decisions impulsively. This was not impulsive. This was the clearest decision I have made in years because the data was clear. And the financial circumstances of your family at the time, Sylvain said carefully, did those influence the decision? They existed, Lysel said. I will not pretend they were absent from the situation. But, counselor, she met Sylvain's silver eyes directly. I had options. Going home was an option. It would have been hard and I would have managed it. I chose this marriage because of who this man is, not because I had no alternatives. A pause. I had a choice. I made it clearly. The council chamber was quiet. The council member to Sylvain's left younger, who had been taking meticulous notes, stopped writing, and then Aldrich stood up. From the observer benches, Sylvain looked at him. A brief exchange in Villari with the council members beside her. Aldrich of the Third Moon, the panel recognizes you. He came forward. He stood before the panel without looking at Lysel, looked at Sylvain. I am submitting documentation, he said. He placed a data drive on the table. This contains procurement records from 7 years ago. Records documenting that Dorian Vale of Proxima Station has made sustained attempts to access Third Moon mineral reserves through legal mechanism for nearly a decade. That the bonding arrangement contracted with my family was not personal in nature but was intended as the legal mechanism for that access. That my daughter was brought to Station 9 as an instrument, not as a partner. He paused. Precisely. I should have brought this forward before now. That failure is mine. But the council should know that the party who filed this inquiry is the same party who arranged the original bonding for purposes of resource acquisition. His interest in dissolving my daughter's current bonding is not cultural concern. It is commercial protection. Real silence. The kind with mass. Sylvain picked up the drive, looked at it, looked at Aldrich. You are the father of the bonded party. Yes. You are submitting evidence against the party who contracted the original bonding arrangement with your family. Yes. Understanding that this will have significant implications for your family's financial position. A pause. Yes, Aldrich said. I understand that. Sylvain held the data drive for a moment, passed it to the council member on her right with words in Villari. The council member took it, began reviewing. Sylvain looked at Lysel, and something in her expression, barely perceptible, just at the edges, shifted. They broke for 2 hours while the council reviewed the documentation. Soren and Lysel sat in the stone courtyard outside the hall. Second moon's pale gold light, something white and small flowering near the wall. The botanical smell from the chamber, but cleaner here, more like itself. Aldrich sat on a bench a few meters away, not too close, not removed, the distance of someone who was respecting a boundary they couldn't fully see. Lysel looked at her father. He was looking at his hands, not performing anything, just sitting with the weight of what he'd done, both the wrong thing and the attempt to correct it. Both of those things carried at once. She stood up, walked to him. Soren looked at the flowers on the wall. After a while, Lysel came back and sat beside him. He didn't ask. "He's not okay," she said. "No. He might not be okay for a while. Probably not. But he's here." She looked at the courtyard, the stone, the flowering wall. "He got on a transport alone and came here and stood in front of a council and said I was wrong, and here is the evidence, and it will cost me to show it." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," Soren said, "it's not." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what word to use for what we are now," she said. "He and I, the old word doesn't fit cleanly anymore, and I don't know the new one yet." "You don't need one today," he said. "No, you can be in process," he said. "People are allowed to be in process without having found the vocabulary for it yet." She looked at him. "In process," she said. "Yeah." She sat with that, then looked back at the courtyard. "You do this too," she said, "with your discharge, with what happened. You're still angry about it. I can see it when the subject comes up. But you don't let it be the only thing you are." "I try not to." "How do you do that?" He thought about it genuinely. "By keeping the choice and the cost separate," he said. "The choice was mine. It was correct. The cost was something that was done to me for making it. Those are two different things, and I don't have to carry the cost as if it was a consequence of being wrong, because it wasn't." A pause. "It's a consequence of other people being wrong that belongs to them." She was quiet for a long time. "I didn't choose to be arranged," she said slowly. "I accepted it because I'd been taught that acceptance was the correct response. But I did not choose to be returned. I did not choose to be called wrong model in front of a crew." She paused. "That was done to me. It doesn't belong to me." "No," he said, "it doesn't. I've been carrying it anyway." "Yeah," he said, "I know." She sat with all of it, the courtyard, the pale gold light, the flowers. Then she said, "I want to put it down." "Okay. I'm not entirely sure how." "That's okay," he said. "It's not something you do once. It's something you keep deciding to do." He looked at her. "But you can start." She breathed. "We can start," she said. And there was that word again. We. Simple and structural, the organizing principle. They sat in the courtyard and waited for the council to reconvene. Sylvain spoke for 11 minutes when the session resumed. Soren caught the key elements. The documentation submitted by Aldrich of the Third Moon had been reviewed and found credible. The party who had filed the validity inquiry had a documented commercial interest in the dissolution of this bonding, specifically access to Third Moon mineral reserves that were protected by Vallari family bonding law. Under Vallari Bonding Code, a validity inquiry filed by a party with demonstrable conflicting commercial interest was subject to heightened evidentiary standards. The testimony of both bonded parties had been reviewed and found to demonstrate genuine intent. And then in standard clearly, this bonding is recognized as legitimate under Vallari Bonding Code. In standard interplanetary law, the inquiry is closed. Soren sat with that for a moment. Just sat. The inquiry is closed. Which meant the bonding stood. Which meant what he already knew. What had already been true in every way that mattered. but which now had 7 signatures and a council seal confirming it in the language of institutions. He looked at Lysel. She was looking straight ahead at the panel, completely still, and then her hand found his under the table. Just that, warm, steady. He held it. The presentation of the stone happened at the end of the formal session. Soren had read about it in the bonding code documentation. The Valari continuance stone, a mineral unique to the third moon, formed over centuries by specific geological and atmospheric conditions that made it exceptionally rare. A substance that, when properly bonded to a human biochemistry, under Valari medical protocol, significantly extended the recipient's lifespan. Not to 300 years, but significantly. Decades, possibly more. Offered to recognize human partners in Valari bondings. 6 times in the council's history. Councillor Sylvain came down from the panel herself, carried a small case, set it on the table, opened it. The stone was smaller than he'd expected. Roughly the size of a large coin, dark at rest, almost black except when the light caught it. When the light caught it, the color lived inside rather than on the surface, not reflected, contained, like something that burned from the inside out. Like certain things did when they meant it. Sylvain said, "This is offered to the recognized human partner in a Valari bonding. It is a recognition, not an obligation. It says you are no longer outside." Soren looked at the stone. He thought about 17 days ago, about a kitchen table and a letter. About not folding, he thought about a dock, coffee that wasn't good, a maintenance bay with mismatched chairs. He thought about a table that had started as a second-hand depot find and become the center of their life. He thought about coffee on the counter in the mornings. He thought about aisle 7. He picked up the stone, held its weight, looked at it for a long time, and then he set it down, gently, without drama. "Thank you," he said. "I mean that genuinely. The offer matters." Sylvain waited. "I'm going to leave it here," he said. Lysel turned to him. "Soren, I've thought about it," he said, not to the council, to her. Looking at her directly. "I thought about it when you told me about your people's lifespan on the first night, on the transit ship at 0300 when we were looking at the stars. I've been thinking about it for months." He held her gaze. "I don't want more time. I've already spent years being present in the technical sense, only alive without being there. What I want is to use the time I have correctly, fully, for something that actually matters." A pause. "I don't need more years. I need to not waste the ones I have. And I won't waste them. Not now." She was completely still, except her eyes. Something moving there fast and deep and finally visible. The thing that had been building behind the precise, careful surface 4 months. The thing he'd been watching arrive gradually in increments, respecting its pace, not rushing it. It had arrived. "You," she said, her voice very quiet, "are going to make this extremely difficult. I've been told that's a pattern." I had prepared a detailed argument for why you should accept the stone. 3 supporting points. A conclusion. I would have been genuinely interested in hearing it. "Soren, Lysel," a pause. "I'm not going to argue with you about this," she said. "Come on." "Good. I am, however," she stopped, looked away from him, then back, the corners of her mouth doing something specific. "You are genuinely impossible. Extensively documented." She made a sound, small, involuntary. The cousin of a laugh. What a laugh sounds like when it's trying to maintain the surface and not entirely succeeding. He loved that sound. He'd been loving that sound for months without saying so, because she was already completely aware of her own comic timing, and there was no need to make it worse. He was going to tell her. Later, when the council wasn't watching. Sylvain looked between them for a moment, and then very slightly, barely perceptible in a way that probably happened once a year at most, the corner of her mouth moved. "The stone will be held in trust," she said. "The decision stands. as all decisions should. She closed the case. That was that. They spent the night on Second Moon. Aldrich had found accommodation near the council hall and came to dinner. The three of them sat at a table that was meant for a larger gathering and ate food that was unfamiliar to Soren in several respects, and he ate all of it because the cook was watching from the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone for whom an empty plate was the highest available compliment. Aldrich and Lysel talked, slowly, testing the ground before putting weight on it. Not everything, not all at once, not the whole of 8 months in one meal, but things, real ones. The kind that are said when the performing is over and the actual conversation can begin. Soren mostly listened. He was good at that. At one point, Aldrich looked at him across the table. "She told me you read the bonding code," he said. "As much as I could follow," Soren said. "All 11 volumes. About 70%. The rest requires cultural context I don't have yet." Aldrich was quiet. "Why?" he said. Same question the council had asked. But weighted differently, not examining the bonding, examining the man. "Because it matters to her," Soren said. "So it matters to me, and I wanted to understand it myself, not have it summarized for me. There's a difference between knowing something and knowing about it." Aldrich looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his daughter. Something in his expression changed. Not resolved, there was no resolving this in one dinner, but something put down. Set aside for now in the particular way of someone who has decided the carrying is doing more damage than the setting down. "Yes," Aldrich said quietly, "there is." They finished the meal. Aldrich said goodnight in Valari first, then Standard. The reflex of someone who had moved between languages long enough that the courtesy had become involuntary. Soren and Lysel walked back to the accommodation through Second Moon's narrow streets. Night here had a different quality than Station 9's manufactured dark. The sky held something that wasn't quite stars and wasn't quite atmosphere, a specific luminescence, particular to Second Moon's orbit position, like the darkness itself was slightly translucent. Beautiful in the way of things that aren't trying to be beautiful. She took his arm, just took it, without announcement. He adjusted his pace to hers. "He's not okay," she said. "No. He might not be okay for a long time." "No. But he came." She looked at the narrow street ahead. "He got on a transport alone and traveled here and stood up in front of the council and said I was wrong. And here is the evidence, even though the evidence costs me." She paused. "That's a beginning, at least, of something." "Yes," he said, "it is." She walked. "I don't know how to carry both things at once," she said. "What he did, and that he came to try to fix it. I can't make them fit together into one feeling." "They don't have to fit," he said. "You can be angry about the first thing and still let the second thing matter. Both things are true. They don't cancel each other out." She was quiet for a while, walking. "I didn't choose to be arranged," she said eventually. "I accepted it because acceptance was what I'd been taught. But I didn't choose to be returned. That was done to me." She paused. "It doesn't belong to me." "No," he said, "it doesn't. I've been carrying it as if it did." "I know." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The narrow street, the particular translucent dark of Second Moon. Buildings that had been here for generations, stone integrated with stone. "I want to put it down," she said. "Okay. I don't entirely know how to do that yet." "You start by deciding to," he said, "and then you keep deciding. That's the whole mechanism." He turned to face her. "You've got time." She looked at him. "We've got time," she said, and then more quietly, "however much there is." She reached up, put her hand against his face. Just that, rested it there. The Valari warmth of her, the steadiness that was slightly different from human warmth, deeper in register. He covered her hand with his. They stood in the narrow street for a moment that didn't need to be anything other than what it was. 1 year later, Station 9 looked the same. It always looked the same. That was the nature of the place. It had been the same since Soren arrived and would be the same long after he was gone because Station 9 was infrastructure. And infrastructure didn't change the way people changed. It just continued. Everything else was different. Soren ran a cargo coordination operation now. Independent, his name on the license. Peril, the woman with the colorful, long-running dispute with Proxima Mercantile Group, had become something between a business partner and an unlikely friend, a relationship that involved weekly arguments about invoicing methodology and a working system that functioned well precisely because neither of them deferred to the other on anything. Dorian Vale had lost the resource access petition. When Aldrich's documentation reached the Proxima Trade Authority, the same document Soren had been building for weeks, combined with the procurement records Aldrich had carried to Second Moon, the petition had been reviewed and found to rest on legally compromised grounds. The filing was voided. Dorian had moved his operations to a different section of the corridor without announcement. He hadn't contacted them. They hadn't contacted him. That particular door had closed from the inside, the way doors should close when there's genuinely nothing worth keeping open. Lysol ran the station archive now, officially with a title and a salary, and 2 junior archivists who she managed with the same precise, unhurried competence she brought to everything. The Valari collection had grown significantly. Other stations along the corridor had begun routing materials to Station 9 because word had traveled that there was someone there who understood not just the language but the meaning. She'd always known how to do this. It had just taken the right space opening up. On the anniversary of the morning they'd gotten married in a corridor between a parts supplier and a canteen, Soren got up early, made coffee, left a cup on the counter, because that was how mornings worked now. Walked to the dock. The morning shift was underway. Manifests being processed, ships being logged. The ordinary machinery of the station's commerce turning as it always did. He stood at the dock edge, at the specific spot, not dramatically, just stood there, looked at the place where a woman had sat in the wedding clothes and held herself together through precise, deliberate effort, and looked up when a stranger walked toward her at 0347 and said the most unremarkable possible thing. He thought about all of it: the maintenance bay, the eggs at 0600, the protein packet that he'd thrown away and never replaced, the second-hand table, the lopsided couch, the archive, aisle 7, we're not folding, Second Moon and the stone he'd picked up and set down again. He thought about all of it and felt full. Not uncomplicated, not the simple version of good that fits on greeting cards. Something with more room in it than that. Something that could hold the things still being worked out. Aldrich and Lysel, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding something broken, the ongoing argument about invoicing with Perel, the Valari vocabulary. He was still getting wrong in ways that apparently created significant social situations. Something that could hold all of that and still be underneath everything full. Real. Worth the noticing. You're going to freeze out here. He turned. Lysel was walking toward him across the dock. Her own coffee in hand, they'd each started carrying their own because waiting for the other created a logistics problem that they'd solved by both simply bringing 2. She stopped beside him, looked at the dock edge, at the specific spot. I was so tired, she said, quiet. That night I had nothing left. I know. And then you walked up. She turned and looked at him. Do you know what you actually said the very first thing? Hey, he said. She almost smiled. Yet, hey. I wasn't prepared. No, she said. You weren't. You were just there, present. That was all. And it was enough. He looked at his wife. Brilliant. Precise. Funny in ways that still ambushed him after a year. More fully herself every day than the day before, like the space she'd been given had been too small for what she actually was, and she was still discovering that, still finding the edges. Hey, he said again. She looked at him. He held out his hand. She looked at it, looked at him. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. You are genuinely strange, she said. Year-long evidence supports this conclusion, he said. She took his hand. They stood at the dock edge where it had started. The stars were still visible at this angle, at this hour. The quarter-quarter traffic hadn't picked up yet, and the sky held a specific quality of early morning, when darkness is just beginning to yield at the edges, everything at the horizon turning gold. Below in Bay 3, a new ship was coming in, someone arriving. Someone at the beginning of something they couldn't see the edges of yet. That was how it always went, not with a map, not with a plan that covered every contingency, just the first step and then the next one, and finding out as you went what you were actually capable of. Soren held his wife's hand at the edge of the dock. The stars burned the way they always burned, quietly, without asking permission, without needing anyone to notice or approve or understand the timeline, just burning. The way things burn when they mean it. And below them, the ship moved into Bay 3, and someone stepped onto the dock, and the story that was about to begin was one that neither Soren nor Lascelles would ever know. But they knew theirs. That was enough.